Kansas City's nonprofit voice. We're telling the stories of Kansas City nonprofits and the people behind them. KC Cares is the intersection of the nonprofit and profit communities, making Kansas City a better place to live, work, and play. This KC Cares segment is brought to you by the Ewing Marion Kauffman Foundation, www.kauffman.org. Nonprofits are busy organizations, whether staffed with one volunteer leader or dozens of paid team members. It's often challenging to find time to listen, learn, and grow. Because time is so pressed to get the work done, the practice of engagement gets the short end of the stick. As part of our Ask the Expert series, Miles Sandler, Director of Policy and Engagement at the Ewing Marion Kauffman Foundation, joins us today to shed some light on engagement and its importance. Welcome, Miles. It's so great to have you with us.
Great to be here.
Well, maybe the best place to start with this whole thing is let's define what engagement is.
Yes, absolutely. I think that oftentimes when folks think about engagement, they really just think about, how do I kind of connect or build relationship with, a particular group. And that's absolutely true. I think that's the base of engagement. But I think when we're talking about, in our nonprofit world, kind of the deeper level of engagement, it's really about how do you build that empathy for the folks ultimately that you either serve or that you're in collaboration with. And then how do you actually learn and listen and incorporate that back into, the work that you do? And so ultimately, I think engagement is truly a two-street conversation. And then from that conversation, you're able to build in a new pathway that improves your work.
What's your experience, your maybe anecdotal knowledge of nonprofits and their attention to engagement?
Yeah, my whole career has been in nonprofit. This, role in where I'm at now is the first time I've been at a private foundation. I've had the blessing of being at the foundation now for 5 years, but previous to that, I've always worked in nonprofits and began my career in community-based organizations, very much, smaller, financially scrappy organizations. And so, my experience through that perspective was, ultimately we were extremely passionate about, the audience that we were servicing, the folks that we wanted to support. I've been in predominantly youth development organizations, and that was always really important, but oftentimes was a challenge to, have the capacity, the resources, the time just to really be able to learn. And so from my perspective, just being in those experiences, it's been about how do you make sure that engagement doesn't get lost, but that it's actually weaved into your everyday in small ways, and then building in that necessary time to actually use that learning for adjustment and for improvement.
I want to dive down into engagement and what that means. When I've encountered it working in nonprofits, it seems like it sits a lot of the time over in development, in the fundraising aspect. But I wanted to touch back for a moment on why does the Kauffman Foundation feel this is important and have someone like you there to help guide organizations?
Yeah, absolutely. So for the Kauffman Foundation, this is really essential. Our mission is to ensure that folks have the ability to have all the opportunities they deserve, and that they can have economic mobility, stability, and eventually potentially prosperity, whether that's through the workforce or whether that's through being an entrepreneur. And if we don't have an intimate understanding of what does an entrepreneur go through, particularly ones that have been marginalized or not able to have the same access to resources and funding as others. And if we don't intimately understand someone that is really striving to build a career, or for a young person that is, looking at their future and trying to understand what their career pathway is, if we don't have an intimate understanding of those constituents, there's really not a great way that we can build into our grant making what's going to be an effective solution, because we're going to miss things. We're going to miss the nuances of the challenges that those individuals face, and then we're not going to fund accordingly to really ensure that we're finding organizations that are going to address those needs, that we're building out strategies, we're building out a policy agenda that's going to address those needs. So the engagement piece is really the almost essential to us actually making impact. Otherwise, we're just going to be a one-sided conversation and providing resources, but without the knowledge to really make sure that they are going to hit the mark.
How big a problem is this for nonprofits then? You've worked in them,
Yeah.
You're dealing with them. Is this a big issue? And if so, how do we crack the nut, so to speak?
Yeah, I think it ranges. So I think that, there's obviously some nonprofits that are really good at this, and they and they may be excellent at engagement, but more challenged with some of the technical aspects, like really getting into their systems and data and what have you. But we also note the opposite end. Actually, some of the larger nonprofits, some of the ones that may have really good sophistication in some of their processes, and in even their kind of financial savvy, but then they lack the authenticity to have real relationships. And sometimes, therefore, again, their work is not as impactful as it needs to be. So I think that there's a range for nonprofits, but I honestly think that it's an opportunity for nonprofits to learn from each other, and to recognize sometimes that there may be certain groups that are really great at engaging and connecting with their constituents. How are they informing the general field? And then how are they also being resourced? And this is a bit of a call out to foundations or other philanthropic partners, right? We have to support engagement. It's essential that that is a part of the grant making, and it's a part of the way that we support nonprofits.
A thought that pops into my mind when you talk about engagement is engagement networking? Or is networking part of engagement?
Yeah, so I think there is lots of different tactics, right? Networking may be a tactic, but the challenge with networking is it's again often kind of one-sided. So you're going out, and yes, you're meeting people, and you're oftentimes from a development standpoint, nonprofits need to get out there and get their name out there and make connections so they can potentially have more funding to support their mission, and all that's essential, but it doesn't have much to do oftentimes with learning, right? And to me, when I define engagement and why it's so important, it is truly about how are you learning from the folks that you again ultimately are either impacting or that you're collaborating with to get something done. And if that learning is not a part of the process intentionally, and then you're bringing that back in and using it in the way that you're doing your strategic planning, in the way that you are actually building out your programming, in the way that you're launching maybe your new initiative, then it's truly not a back and forth conversation. The last piece too is oftentimes, again, networking will be maybe a short term, but it doesn't have that feedback loop, right? So if you're gaining a lot of information, let's say through a survey, through focus groups, whatever the mechanism you're using through the constituency group that you're interested in, what's that feedback loop? How are you getting information back out to those groups? And if you're not able to do that, how are you being transparent about that from the get-go? That this is not something we have the mechanism for. And so when you're asking people for their information, or you're trying to learn from that group, that you're transparent about the expectations for yourself and for that group.
A few moments ago, you also mentioned there's really two tracks of engagement. Let's go there. Let's go there. Tell us about those tracks and why each is important.
Yeah. I mean, I think that kind of the two tracks that I see is there's one around, relationship building, and, sometimes that fits in that networking space, and, really connecting for development's sake, for getting your name out there. But again, that other track is really, to me, about learning. There can be very formalized learning processes, again, like surveys, focus groups, kind of learning interviews. Those can take place, and there can be a, very specific kind of way to gather that information, make sure that you're weaving it into your next steps in your planning process. But there's also less formalized ways of engagement, by doing an event, celebration, a neighborhood gathering. And you can still weave in learning into that. So you can have a simple exit survey. You can have interactive boards where people can actually record their experience or thoughts, live polling. A lot of these are actually very inexpensive, easy to do, and they're, again, great ways to capture learning in a maybe less formalized process.
How do you go about having your team learn how to do engagement? I mean, I think we sometimes make an assumption that people know.
Yes. Yeah, I do think we make an assumption often that people know. And if it's not your orientation, you probably don't. And so some of the ways that I guide my team is, first and foremost, don't engage just for engagement's sake. Have a North Star, have a purpose. You need to have a learning question that is very clear and aligned with your goals. You need to ensure that you have a goal that you're actually trying to learn so that you can improve your processes or improve your planning or your strategy. And this may weave into a design process. This may weave into, you want to build some initiative or coalition. But whatever the thing is, make sure that you're clear on what you're trying to achieve. And then the other thing that I really emphasize with my team is be transparent. You need to make sure that you're clear on what your goals are and that you communicate that well to the folks that you're engaging, particularly if it's a more formalized, kind of engagement process, like a survey or focus groups or what have you, or you're convening people kind of to gain information from them. You want to make sure that you're really being upfront of, like, are you able to get that information back out to them? Will there be a summary of kind of results? What's the timeline for that? What are you going to be using this information for? What is it intending to inform? And so as much as you can have transparency, and even if that transparency is, we won't have the capacity to get back to you, letting people know that up front so that when they're coming into that process, they're making a choice and they're comfortable with that choice. So too many times we provide expectations to folks that, is not actually going to line up with what really happens.
Well, I think there's nothing worse than somebody asking your opinion because they're wanting it for some reason, and then you never know.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Absolutely. And, if the best practice is compensation. So if you're going to ask someone to provide you that kind of formalized information through engagement, that they're compensated for their time and effort. We know that that's not always possible for all nonprofits, but even something sometimes as simple as making sure that there's food provided, making sure that there is, some type of acknowledgement that they've taken out time from their schedules, from their day, from their lives to support your work. And sometimes it's even just, folks are willing to do it because they believe in your mission too. But you have to make sure that that's been articulated, that this is what this is for, so that folks can make clear choices in how they want to engage.
Is there a fear factor? And maybe I should explain that a little more. I'm in an organization and I know what we need to do. Our team is on board and we're going down this path, but we're going to do a survey so that we can hear from our clients and stakeholders. And we get feedback that says, oh no, don't open a third location of your food pantry. Have a mobile vehicle. I made that whole scenario up, but
of course,
I mean, I could see staff kind of going, we're already down this path. Now, now what?
Absolutely. No, there's absolutely a fear factor. I've experienced it in organizations I've worked at where, sometimes there's decisions that have been made, sometimes not even because of staff, but because that's what a donor has decided that they will pay for, or that's what leadership or a board member has been advocating for. And all of a sudden you do engagement work and you realize that that's actually not what the community wants or whoever that you serve wants. It's actually not going to address the core issue. So that's a very scary factor. There's two things I think that nonprofits can do. First and foremost, again, weave in engagement early, right? So you should be having on a regular basis some kind of mechanism to hear from your constituency groups, right? So that you don't get that far down the line, that you understand what people need. And qualitative data is super, super important. Sometimes one of the biases I think that nonprofits can have is we can have a lot of data, right? Qualitative data is not there. So we have a lot of quantitative data. We have even sometimes surveys, or we have, what the numbers say. Here's what the stats say. But without that qualitative data, you're often missing nuances. So I'll give a quick example. I used to work for an organization in DC called DC Promise Neighborhood Initiative. And we were really trying to figure out, how do we ensure that more families have access to healthy food in the neighborhood that we were focused on? Because we know that when, young people have better access to food, they do better academically. We'd already bared that out. We also knew the level of kind of food insecurity in our community, so on and so forth. So we started going down a path with lots of different options. And then, thank goodness, we paused and said, okay, let's actually talk to our constituents. And so we did a bunch of interviews. We had some focus groups. And what we really found out from that, was that not only we already knew that we were in a bit of a food desert, but what the access points that actually made sense for families. Because originally where we were thinking about kind of putting a farmer's market and what have you, it ended up just really not making sense for the community. But once we listened, we realized, well, we can actually do this whole monthly food drive right in the school, and we can link it to some of the parent conference things that the teachers wanted to do. So we ended up getting just this really great synergy, a great pour out from the community, and it just was much better alignment. So that constant, just continuous learning through qualitative is really important.
We're talking with Miles Sandler. She's Director of Policy and Engagement at the Kauffman Foundation. We're talking about engagement. So you've mentioned a number of tools. Are these things that folks can come to the Kauffman Foundation for resource help? How can you guide us? And I am thinking of, those nonprofits that are under a $500,000 budget. I can see leaders going, yeah, I want to do this, but money.
Yeah, I mean, that is not something that we have at the foundation as a great resource. I know we have a very active conversation internally about how do we build and support more capacity for our nonprofits. But I do think that there are great organizations across our community, Nonprofit Connect and others, that really are sources to think about how to support all aspects of your nonprofit. I also think that there are some really interesting learnings that can be taken from, honestly, organizing. So there's tons of research that's been done around kind of good organizing skills. And although, a nonprofit may not be doing traditional organizing, right, which we often think about for more political reasons or what have you, but the skill set is very much a part of how you think about how do you gain trust, how do you build relationships, how do you connect people around common goals, how do you understand the challenges that a group is dealing with and then elevate those as a part of your agenda. So I think that's a really good learning tool, and there's tons of kind of resources around that. And then the second one too that I have learned a ton from is really learning the design process. So getting a training on how do you do really good design work. This comes out of oftentimes industry and people creating products, but it really starts with an empathy lens, right? How do you really understand your customer? How do you understand how they think, their motivations, and their way of kind of reacting to the world? And then from there, how do you then step through that design process to actually create, your product, your service, what have you? And so I think those processes are very helpful. And there's just so many options right now for that type of training that it's very much, I think, available. And there's a lot of free resources too online.
I think it's interesting. You keep talking about clients or constituents and the need to listen to them, to not make assumptions that you, the organization, know the right way to meet them, but to get feedback from them kind of in a continuous loop.
Yes.
That what your work is doing is meeting their need.
Yeah.
How important is engagement within the organization itself and listening, when you've got group, things grow and grow and grow and grow?
Yeah, that's a great question. So that's actually something we do quite a bit at the foundation. And I'm very thankful for that level of culture here, where we have an annual associate survey. So that is, one piece. But then what we do with that survey is we really kind of break it out by department, and each department really looks at that data and then identifies 2 or 3 goals from that data that they want to support or develop within their department to, improve, support one another better, what have you. And that survey really has to do with a few different indicators. So we look at trust. We look at, and how associates are trusting each other, kind of work environment in general. We also look at, racial equity and what are people's perceptions of our inclusion and diversity and racial equity work, and how is that resonating with them as individuals? So that is been an essential tool. Honestly, it's, coming to the foundation was one of the first times that I experienced the level of robust kind of interpersonal associate work that we have here. And that learning is continuous, and it really helps to improve and make us better. What I would say for smaller organizations that may not, again, time, capacity, resources may be thinner, that you really carve in some of that process time with your team when you're kind of in those moments where you're going to have to come together. So there's always kind of budget planning time that happened in the year that you have to carve out time for. You just know it because it's essential to the operating of your organization. Well, there's nothing wrong with also building into that time that you have some intentional reflection opportunities for your teammates to really, look at what can we do internally to improve and support one another. And again, that transparency piece is super important to that. So don't forget that. And establishing what are your goals even amongst your, internal team. That North Star is essential to that process as well.
I got to bring in the big P word, although it's shifted, the pandemic. I just wondered quickly, as we're nearing the end of our time together, have you seen the engagement or the looking at engagement? Has that shifted at all because of the craziness of the pandemic? Are we better at it, or do we need to come back and focus on it?
That's a great question. And I think it's a challenging one because I think we don't know exactly yet. On one end, I think that we saw some really creative aspects of humanity during the pandemic, right? Folks recognizing that, we have to use these virtual mechanisms, but that doesn't mean that it has to be flat, right? That the same concept of how do you make something engaging, interactive? How do you make sure that people can really communicate in lots of different ways? One thing I'll just elevate is that I think for a lot of introverts who sometimes get silenced in meetings, having a chat option was revolutionary, to be able to communicate in a different way. And we need to keep that even in person meetings, and having mechanisms that are very clear for different learners and for different types of communicators. So on one end, I think that we, learned some things and we were able to, make sure that we kept connecting. On the flip side, and I think that this is even more evident in our children, honestly. I think if you talk to most teachers, this year of coming back into the classroom was challenging, not for all the obvious reasons, but also for the reasons that for a lot of those children, they hadn't learned how to socialize in the same way for 2 years. And it is a skill set. And I think for adults, it's similar too, we have a little bit of a quicker turnaround, but socialization is a skill set. We have to remind each other how to be kind to one another and how to give each other grace. And that is something we'll just keep having to remind each other of.
That's so interesting that you bring it up. I've heard other parents say, particularly with really young children, if they go into a preschool classroom, let's say, and they haven't been there, what a lesson on learning how to engage. And all they've seen are masked faces, in person, what does a real person look like with a smile on their face? You've given us just great, great advice. I hope our audience will take heed, and we'll put this on our Facebook, but those 4 critical points of best practice, having a North Star, have a process, just don't throw it out there. Think about how you're going to do it. Being transparent. I love that. It opens you up to, oops, did I make a mistake? But better to learn it now than to be down the path. And, creating connection. Those are just really, really wonderful. And how lucky we are to have you at the Kauffman Foundation as a resource and somebody to call up and say, well, can you give me some advice? I need some help with this.
Well, this is a passion area of mine. Again, I think creating connection with people is one of the most important things we can do, whether that's telling our story, telling our organization's story, or inviting someone to tell us their story. We are, I think, as humans, just connected by stories. And so, yes, I'm always excited to help anyone and provide suggestions, but also to hear what they're doing and learn from them.
And the importance of listening.
Yeah.
That's great. Miles, thank you so much. We really appreciate your time and your expertise.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Ruth, and thank you for everything that you're doing.
Thank you for joining us for KC Cares, Kansas City's nonprofit voice. We're produced by Charitable Communications, also a nonprofit. This KC Cares segment was brought to you by the Ewing Marion Kauffman Foundation, www.kauffman.org. To be a guest on KC Cares or underwriting opportunities to support the work we're doing, please visit our website, kccaresonline.org, and spread the love. You can find us on Facebook and Twitter at KC Cares Radio and Instagram at KC Cares Online. And catch us on Saturday mornings at 8 a.m. on ESPN 1510 AM and 94.5 FM. Thank you for joining us on KC Cares.